Hello, and welcome to the world's famous Adventures Club of Los Angeles. I am Ray Perez, and tonight we'll be talking about the monuments of men and women in the United States Army. The Monument program deploys individuals to countries that are in conflict to find artifacts and artwork and monuments to be able to save the heritage of the countries that those art and monuments belong to. So tonight we have our very own monument officer, Captain Sonia Dixon. Captain Dixon, welcome to the club.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm looking forward to tonight. I'm sure there's a lot of people interested in art. We all paid attention to our art history classes.
I hope so.
I would love to hear where it all began for you, how you became interested in joining the Monuments Men, even further into your childhood.
Ooh, okay. So when it comes to art history, I wasn't exposed to it until my undergrad. So I studied art history, but even before that, my dad took my sisters and I to New York City. We went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I remember specifically being in the Egyptian gallery, and of course, right, it's the Met, so it's very full. And I remember looking around, seeing, different types of people, but the one memory that really sticks with me is hearing all the different languages that was being spoken in that one gallery. And I think I was in high school still. So for me, it was great, right? Because I'm biracial, so grew up, being Black and Korean. But to see, art bringing all these different people together from different social classes, different countries, I loved it, right? I just fell in love with it. And of course, the Met itself is beautiful. And then in high school, we had a teaching assistant, and it was a Spanish class, right? So, to me, unassuming Spanish class. But when it came to his turn to teach, he put up a painting of El Greco, and I remember I was like, oh wow, this is just a very great, vibrant painting, without thinking anything of it. And then he starts talking about all the historical elements that's featured in the painting, right? And like I said, I wasn't exposed to art history before then, but to see so much history that can be told from a painting, I was in love. I was like, this is amazing. Fast forward to undergrad, I started with dental hygiene, so not art history at all. I didn't do so well in A&P, anatomy and physiology. So a couple years after, I was like, okay, what can I do that I love, and that's just interesting. And I typed in history because I love history, and I typed in art, and I discovered that you can study art history, you can work in a museum, and that's it, right? And then I changed my major to art history my junior year. That same year, I signed up for the National Guard, and I went to basic training that summer, and the next, I come back in the fall, took my art history classes, fell in love, and been doing it ever since.
Now, were you the only kid in the classroom that was interested in art, or were other kids interested as well?
I was definitely the only one.
Really? Why is that?
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's just history classes, right? People look at history and they're like, oh, yeah, that's cool. But to me, I just thought it was fascinating. You had, I can't remember the name of the painting, but you had, well, it's actually a fresco that's in a church. But, you had a dead person, and you're like, okay, well, who are these people around this person in the middle? And it wasn't just, just people there, but there were very specific individuals that were featured, who is closer to the body? Why are they featured closer to the body? Looking at the different hierarchies in the painting, the different colors that are being used. And El Greco, that name itself, I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So, and it's funny because a few years later, I went to Spain. It was my first international trip by myself, and the first day I was there, I saw that painting. I didn't know we were going to go to that church. Full circle.
Right. Well, that's really great. Did you find community or have peers that were eventually interested in what you were doing before you went into the Monuments program?
I did. I will say, during my undergraduate years, because I was in ROTC, I was never able to really experience art history like the other students. I always, had to do my military training. Sometimes I would come into class late in my uniform because we were doing field training to get us ready for a larger field exercise. So I was unfortunately, because of, joining the military to help pay for school, I wasn't able to. Later in life, I think when I did my master's, yes, but before that, everyone was interested, and I was too, but I just, didn't have the opportunity to really get into it until later.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question to ask because, I don't think I became interested in art. I don't have a memory of it in high school or elementary school. I do remember a class in college, and I was bored out of my mind in that class. But, I don't think it was me. I think at one point in time, I thought it was just I was not interested, and maybe there was something wrong with me. But I do feel that there's just been a lack of education on art and the history of art. And it seems like what the Monuments program is doing is pursuing a broader spectrum of that, so people have a greater understanding, and with that, an appreciation of what's behind the art. And I think then that could start to get people invested in learning more about it. So, with these programs in school and in college that people may or may not have gravitated towards, do you think there's area for improvement?
Absolutely. So in the civilian side, I'm a PhD candidate, and we're able to teach art history survey courses. And I know there was a group of us who were really adamant in changing the way we taught it, because typically you're exposed to it from a Western European background, but I was interested in everything else, with the Western European. But there's so many different places in the world, right? Like if you look at this map, that's only a snippet of the entire world. And yeah, so when I teach it, I try to share with the students how it's relatable to you, and how, first the history of how we teach Western art, why we teach it, because to me that's important. Right, that's the history. You learn about art history, but we're taught it from a really specific reason, and I think that's an interesting thing to do. And I think even learning that history, it changes the lens of things. So I start with teaching the beginning of art history, at least in the United States, because it's different in many different countries. And I think once you establish that, and then establish that art history is visual culture, it's not just paintings on a wall, it's so many different things. It can be a pot, it can be frescoes, it can be graffiti. And then, so that's art history, and with cultural heritage, because I got my master's in Museum and Cultural Heritage Studies, with cultural heritage, you also have intangible heritage, so things that you can't hold on to. So I think about oral history, that's part of someone's heritage. I think about dances, songs. So even with the program, it's how do we preserve those things when there is conflict?
Right. Because it seems like, from my experiencing just through travel, I really didn't start to appreciate art until I visited other countries and got to see it firsthand. But not only that, I was exposed to what that country was going through, so I could be able to understand the art better. And once I was able to do that, I saw nuance. I saw a spectrum. And I feel it seems like a lot of the art that's introduced early on in my education was through a very filtered lens. It was, focusing on European art as fine art. They took ownership of that word as fine art. But really, it seems like what you're doing is kind of broadening that window to say, fine art doesn't have to be what were introduced in textbooks, which might mostly be paintings that come from people that had the resources to do paintings. It could be a broader spectrum of people that we don't pay attention to, whether it's a tribe in Ethiopia or whether it's a flute player in Bali. You have all these different people with different perspectives that in itself is fine art. So I'm hoping, can you, from your own perspective, kind of open up that window for us to see that it's not just the fine art, but the Western world that we're getting education to, that the Monuments program can actually open that broader, as you're saying, on different cultures that could see things. And through that lens, tell us what could potentially be the future of how we receive art or see art or partake in art.
Yeah. Well, if you want, do you want to start with World War II, like how we started?
Let's do it.
And
yeah.
So if you can go to the first World War II photo. Okay. So I guess like before we talk about like what the program is now, the program in World War II, all right, so what's, a lot of people know the Monuments Men, and it's exactly that, like preserving the fine arts, right? So for example, we have a Leonardo da Vinci photo, or painting that was recovered. And then the next photo.
And this is artwork that the Nazis at the time, through Hitler, preferred to take from places like France or Poland.
Exactly, yes. And then this is another painting or another artwork that was recovered. So it's a statue by Michelangelo, the Madonna of Bruges. So with the World War II Monuments Men, I'll go back in history. So the program started, right, World War II was happening, and there were a group of people that wanted to do some preservation of artworks that a lot of them were being stolen by the Nazis, right? Or being destroyed, right? Some were, going to be used for the museum, some were just going to be damaged completely. So there was a group of people that went to Europe to do the recovery. So lesser known are the background people, right? So you think about it, if you were to go in country, there has to be boots on the ground, right? The people that go out, and actually retrieve the things. But there's a lot of behind the curtains that's happening, right? So the intel that's happening, the research into, where things are located, what they are, and then, of course, you have some spies that were part of the Monuments Men and Women because they had to get the information. So, of course, I want to highlight the people that were in physical harm's way, like in country, but the program could not have been successful without all the people behind it. And, I think we should really highlight those people. So there were artists, there were art historians, archaeologists, and that entire group became the Monuments Fine Arts and Archives team. And there were men and women, but it was also an international effort. Like since World War II, it was an international effort, and even now it's an international effort. So this painting, or excuse me, this picture that you see here. So this is when I was at the American Archives, and you can see two monuments officers. So we have on the left is Edith Standen. So she's from the U.S. Army. So she was part of WWII, so the Women Army Corps. And then to the right, we have Captain Vallon. So she's from France. So, like I said, there were women that were there the whole time in many different countries. International effort. Captain Vallon was also part of the French resistance, right? So her character was portrayed in the movie, if you've seen it. But yeah, so.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the French resistance. I'm very curious, and maybe we don't have an answer for this, or maybe we do. Mm-hmm. Why weren't they recognized? Why were there only a specific group of people? And is it just the culture of war? So we have the program coming in and saying we're entering this war zone to save art. All the other troopers, they could be like, we don't care about art. We're fighting a war here. We're talking about lives. Is that one potential reason why sectors of that group were overlooked, because priorities and romance of war, perhaps itself, became the focus, and this area was not? And so if you weren't within that small spotlight, you weren't seen?
I think that's part of it, right? So it's not as, like if you're not on the ground, it's not as sexy, right? So like, you're like kicking down doors and actually grabbing things. I think that's part of it. I think also part of it is some of the people that were in the back were not in the military. So there were civilians helping out, like giving their time and resources to like help this initiative that they thought was really important. And then, so there's another component of it. And, it's a challenge that I think we still will face is, other service members who don't understand the importance of this, right? So you may think, well, why would I care about painting when there's people that are, dying, right? Like, it's a conflict.
almost an age-old question of what's more valuable, the human life or a piece of artwork.
Exactly. So, you had people that, obviously for a great reason, thinking that, right, it's human life. You can't replace human life. And then you also have the component where people think, it's just a thing, right? We can always replace a thing. And I think like that's art, but when you think about like cultural heritage, which, is art, but like if you don't understand like the lens of it, so like that tangible thing has been there for hundreds of years. So it's part of people's history. So maybe it's not, so say a Leonardo, painting is not part of someone's family, that we may think, right, from the United States perspective, but some people do think that. And I think that's a really important factor to keep in mind, that maybe, I think because the United States is so young, right, per se, there are other places in the world, a lot of places in the world, where they think cultural heritage is an extension of their arm. Right, so like maybe that maybe that's rare for us to understand, but you can go through history, and there are people who have literally put their lives on the line, have died to protect a building, to protect like a mosque or something, right? Like it's happened, and it's still happening. So I think that's a great example to show that maybe we don't recognize it, but there are people that it's not whether human life or cultural heritage is one or the other, but some people say that it's even, right? So it's not necessarily one or the other, but like, well, there has to be a way to kind of do both at the same time. But I will say with the Monument Officer Program, human life is, of course, safety in human life is going to be at the forefront. So what we're trying to do with this iteration is trying to be proactive rather than only reactive, right? Because World War II, we went in after the conflict has started, but now we're trying to, go to different countries and share the resources that we have, the knowledge we have to do like preservation. So this is not only in conflict zones, right? So, of Iraq, for example, that's like a big one that comes to mind. But we also have training in other parts of the world where, it's not just conflict. For example, we sent a couple guys, monument officers to Honduras to help them assess cultural heritage sites, and climate change is a big thing, right? So once again, being proactive. So establishing where those sites are, how they might be susceptible to, floods, landslides, so we can give them the agency to do it beforehand. And we are trained, so that's a photo of some of the group in Honduras. And, we're trained to do, sorry, lost my thought. We're trained to do many different things, but there's also a group, so because we're trained with the Smithsonian the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, we are taught to do different types of preservation work. So like one of the things when it comes to, like if there was like a bomb, right, if a place is susceptible to bombing, they're taught to do like learn sandbags to protect frescoes, things that are too large or just, permanent features of, a building that can't be moved, right? So it's trying to share that information rather than it's just, it's the United States going to come in and save the day, right? It's trying to teach the people, like different host countries, like how to preserve their own cultural heritage.
Well, that's really interesting. It's like a two-way street. It's one, us being respectful and trying to be in their shoes, but also at the same time, them seeing us having the willingness to try to see through their eyes. And that could take time to really blend together properly. What I find really interesting is, going to the subject of trying to get into people's shoes, as Americans, or Westerners, how do we see what's valuable to somebody else and understand why it's valuable to them? One thing that stood out to me, recently I watched a show called The Man in the High Castle. It's a science fiction show about Hitler if he had won the war. Yeah. So what he does is he takes the Liberty Bell, for example, and melts it. And me watching that was shocking. And maybe it's something like that, or I can see that's something that's very important to me. Can be something else to someone else. But having that shock allows me to put myself in the shoes of another person from another country who may be experiencing these things in real life. And to some degree, we did experience that with Americans, with our own monuments on 9/11. But for the most part, how are we able to look through the eyes of others and be able to find value in the art the way they see it?
Well, I think it's important to note that with this newer iteration, we are really trying to give agency to the host countries. So we like for us, we are asking, what do they find valuable? And it's talking to many different populations, right? Because like the government may say one thing, a minority group, or marginalized group may say another thing. So it's talking to the people on the ground and asking them, what do you identify as cultural heritage? What do you identify as something that's important that we don't want to lose? And like one example is we may come in and say, oh wow, that building is really old, we have to protect it. And the local people are like, no, like we don't actually care about that. Rather, we care about this rock, right? This rock has so much significance. So it's us listening, lessons learned, right? It's us listening to the host nations and helping whatever they do. It's like, it's not our job to define it for them. It's, our job to listen, respect them, and help preserve it that way.
That's an interesting dance. Because sometimes something can be valuable to a different population, while the direct population that you're interacting with finds no value in it at all. And to be able to communicate them on a level that respects what they're saying about their own environment, it's a specific skill set. Absolutely,
absolutely. You have to have. Right, there's like a little bit of like diplomacy that kind of goes into it, but we know you're through the program we're trained about different types of resources, and hopefully if there's nothing that we can do, maybe we can at least share the resources. Like, hey, there's this information that's out there, there's this kind of funding that's out there that can help you do preservation on your own.
Well, what's really interesting is the Monuments Men, or Monuments Program, started in the 1940s. That wasn't that very long ago. So it's like the science is still fairly new in figuring it out. Like, are there any precedents that you're able to follow when you go into these situations?
There's a little bit. So if you could go to the Iraq photos. So this is a photograph from the Iraqi National Museum in Baghdad. So there was a looting in 2003. The next photo. So this is Corey Wegner. So Corey Wegner is a retired major in the Army, and she was one of the soldiers that went in and helped to preserve like Jewish artifacts out of the National Museum. There was also U.S. Marines that went in and recovered some artwork. If you go to the next photo.
And this is Baghdad.
Yes. Yeah, and then, so this is a head that was recovered. So the U.S. Marines actually helped return this famous statue. So it would have been, the eyes would have been inlaid, the eyebrows would have been inlaid also, would have been very colorful. Right, this was a very valuable thing. And then the next photo. And then we also have this vase that was recovered. So, go back to the question.
Well, the question was, what's the precedent of
the precedent? Yeah, so because the director of the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative is Corey Wegner, right? So she was in the Army, she retired, she established the Blue Shields in the United States, and now she's the director of SCRI. So there's a memorandum of understanding with SCRI and the U.S. military, and they helped train us. So hearing the more recent, right? So you have World War II, but hearing like more recent issues that were happening from her has been unbelievable. So you hear about the logistical issues, right? So there were artifacts that from from like Jewish collection that needed to be frozen so the manuscripts wouldn't be damaged. So it's her trying to figure out how to find a large freezer and get it out of the country, right, to have some preservation. And then you also hear the same issue that we talked about before is people that don't understand the importance of art, right? Like, why are we gonna come and save these things? So you have the U.S. Marines that actually went and recovered thousands of things. And it goes, and I like this photo because it kind of ties that back together, right? So why, like another reason why to care and lessons learned. So one of the major issues with looting, destruction of cultural heritage, and why the U.S. military and other, allies would go in and save it. So this is a carved vessel, possibly an offering to Inanna, and if you can see, there's a lot of broken pieces here, right? So a lot of broken pieces. You see some parts that are blank. This is a restoration, so like we lost those pieces. So you might think, oh, well, it's old, right? Like that's why. But actually, if you were to take something, if you were to loot something during a wartime, how would you get it from point A to point B? If you smash it and put it in a bag or put it in some kind of case, it's easier to travel with, right? So another major issue and a major concern that I think just the general public should be with art history and like lessons learned, like why do we care about this, is, there's been evidence that looted objects directly fund the black market, which directly funds terrorism. And I don't think any of us want to support terrorism. So I think from like a larger population, right, like we should all be invested in this. So that's another thing that we've learned, which is one of the reasons why we were trained by like the FBI art crime team. So they taught us how to go onto a site and take documentation and photographs of a site that may have been intentional damage, because intentional damage to cultural heritage is a war crime, right? So making sure we get those documentation and, maybe later on we can go back and, people are punished for it, which has, happened recently. People were punished for, that war crime in particular.
So the precedent was set then by this woman who was participating in the Baghdad raid. And from that, you learned a lot of what you know now through her?
I think through her program, and also like civilian entities. So as a civilian, like after her, after she retired from the Army, she also did a response in Haiti after the earthquake. So taking her military and civilian experience, right, destruction. So it goes back to part of it, I think, realizing, well, let's not only react to things, like how do we do things to preserve, in the meantime. So, which is why like climate change is a big thing that we're doing now. Yes, because there's so many aspects into preservation. It's not just conflict, which is amazing that, that we're doing that part of this program.
Well, it's interesting hearing what you were talking about. So there's World War II and then there's Baghdad. World War II seemed to be there was genuine fine art interest, with Hitler taking the art and wanted to have the exhibits for himself in a gallery somewhere. There was an appreciation for that art. Whereas with Baghdad, it seemed a lot of what was there was just ransacked for profit to be able to put it in through the black market. So there's a change in culture in how art is looked at least within these two projects that the program was involved in. Is that natural to the course of time? Is there a deterioration for the appreciation of art, which now people are seeing the value mostly for profit as opposed to a genuine interest in what's being spoken to?
I definitely think that there's still people that find, traditional fine arts, or what we define as traditional fine arts, as important and critical, right? Like, I mean, even now you can see that there are paintings being stolen from museums. So I think, it is there for a response. But I also think that because people know that, what we define as like fine art, I think they know that it's valuable, which is why it makes it valuable on the black market, right? So like it's still valuable, but like they've seen, they kind of manipulate it a little bit and seen like how can they profit from it rather than just have it in their house.
So what were the lessons learned from Baghdad?
The lessons learned from Baghdad, another lessons learned is to train the military. So training military, so one of our jobs as a heritage preservation officer could be to advise our commanders, advise them. These are locations where there is some kind of cultural heritage, whether it's a site, whether it's a historical important site. So talking to them about that, talking about them to like other lessons learned, right? Because you also have like the conflict in Bosnia that happened. So there's many different things, like many different historical events that happened to create the lessons learned. So talking to the commanders about maybe you shouldn't bomb this area for these reasons, right? So one reason is of course to preserve cultural heritage, but there's also there's a good morale, right? Like, let's not destroy art. It's important, right? So as an art historian, we may see it that way. But there's also like the practical reason. People like their history. People like their cultural heritage. They don't want things that, they've seen all their life to be gone. So if you're trying to convince the people to, respect you and say like, hey, we're the U.S. military, we're trying to help you, maybe let's not, blow things up. And to show them, like, we respect not only you as a person, but we respect your culture, we respect your community, we respect your history. So that's another lessons learned. And with that, we also, talk to the soldiers, and there were programs established before they deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, but I think it's taken much more serious than it has been before because of the lessons learned, because we see what happens when when you don't respect cultural heritage. It's like it happened in Iraq. There were occasions where U.S. military members were, taking artifacts from, like Saddam's palace. So telling them like, hey, it's bad. One, it's illegal. But another one, this is another reason why, because you're at the end of the day, it's not yours to take. And at the end of the day, it's still the heritage of the people of that land.
That's interesting. Do you think there was training for how they approach other people's artifacts during that period of time?
There were some training. I think it's one of those things that I'll be honest, I don't know like how in depth it was, but I think now with the new iteration, like one of the reasons why this new iteration is pushed is because of that. So we also have the 1954 Hague Convention that was ratified, that tells commanders, that tells U.S. military members that it is illegal, it is against the law to do this destruction, and taking things is part of that destruction.
That's really interesting. It seems like the fact that, as Americans, as Westerners, as we're starting to become more of a global civilization, these lessons in how we interact with other countries is something we're still just starting to understand. Because really, we didn't enter the global forum, because the United States is only 200 years old, a little over 200 years old. So this is all still fairly new for us to understand, but it almost seems like we grew up thinking we did understand, but the truth is we don't understand of how people are, and we just have to listen to what these cultures are saying.
Yeah, and like I said, lessons learned, right? We've learned a lot over the years, right? That's just part of life. It's part of the military's history. And we are trying to be more proactive as far as the different types of preservations that we can do. And, accepting that, this is the problems that we had in the past. Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. And so at this point in time, you were actually not part of the monuments program in 2003.
No, I was not. So
you're hearing all this, and you're hearing this woman making a difference, at least presenting this new worldview on start to appreciate other artifacts. Where did you go from there? Like, where were you at that time, and where did you go from there?
So I graduated high school in 2008. But I grew up in a military town. So my dad was active duty for 20 years. My mom has so that's a picture of my dad and my older sister and I coming back from Desert Storm. And my grandfather on my mom's side, so my mom's father, he was a officer in the Republic of Korea Army, right? So coming from a military background, right, I just grew up with the military, and when the war kicked off, I think my perspective was very different, right? So, you saw Iraq, but especially when it first kicked off, I don't think I was aware of so many things. And then during my undergraduate period, I took an Islamic art class, and that was my exposure to what was, for me, it was like what my exposure was to Iraq, what was happening. And you understood Mesopotamia, and you hear about the rich history, and how that history, a lot of that stuff is the foundations of Western history, Western civilization, right? So things come from that, and I was like, oh my God, I never knew this, right? Because the way that a lot of outlets or whatever exposed it was so foreign, it was so different. So taking that class, I was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. So this is a picture of me. I went to Morocco for 2 months to learn Arabic, and this is a factory, where they were making tiles, right, the old way by hand. So I got to experience that. And then when I started my master's in museum and cultural heritage, the first semester, we were talking about, just what is cultural heritage. And I remember I came across an article about what's known as the Monuments Men of Iraq, and this was during the time that the movie, with George Clooney came out. And I, reading that article, I was like, oh wow, this is interesting. And then I saw Major Corey Wegner.
And this is around 2013, I believe.
This is 2013.
Gotcha.
And I thought, wow, one, this is a really cool job. Two, it's a woman, right? A female officer doing it. And then, I became interested, but that program, the program that's now, it didn't exist still. So fast forward a little bit more, one of my jobs in the military was a public affairs officer. And one of the class assignments was interview whoever, right? We need you to interview, write an article about it. So they encouraged us, use whoever, go big, the president, right, Lady Gaga, or whatever. And I thought, I wonder what that major is doing that went to Iraq, right? Very nerdy of me. So I looked her up. I saw that she was at the Smithsonian at that time, and I just, I cold called her and said, hey, this is me.
Did she pick up the phone herself?
Yeah, well, it was an email, but yeah, she responded. I was like, look, I think I was a lieutenant at the time. I was like, I'm at this public affairs course. I read about you. I'm in art history. I do art history, cultural heritage, and I just want to interview. It's just for an assignment. And, she gave the interview. She was so nice. She gave me so much information about being in this field, because when she was in Iraq, she was actually a director of a museum. So, giving me information about working in a museum, but also being in the military, and, the challenges, right? Time-wise, you're going back and forth so much. Yeah, so I just remember that, and I just wrote the article, and I was like, oh, that was so great. And then fast forward a few years, I was in my office, during my time when I was at Florida State University, and one of my colleagues was like, hey, did you see this article about them trying to start like the new Monuments Men and Women program? And I was like, oh no, I actually haven't. So I saw it, I read the article, and then Corey was quoted in the article, and I was like, I'm just gonna email her just to like see how she's doing. And actually during that time, I was going to hang up my hat and get out of the military because I just really wanted to focus on art history because I've never had the chance to do that. And I emailed her and I was like, hey, I see what you guys are doing. It looks great. I'm so happy for you. And then she said, hey, do you think you want to stay a little bit longer and join the reserves who do this program? And, just being me, I thought, sure, why not? So it's it's like full circle, right? Like being able to finally meet Corey in person, a fabulous woman, brilliant, like even the team at Scry, a great team. It's amazing, right? Like full circle again.
Awesome. You meet your hero.
Yeah, she, definitely my shiro. Yeah, love it.
And she definitely meets or surpassed your expectations.
Of course.
I don't know how many people get to experience that, but that is something really amazing and special.
Yes, and we still work with each other. Now we have different meetings for something else, but talking to her, and I was just like, it's just crazy, So I think I'm very big on just going for it because you just never know. Like I said, I never thought that I would be in the military and doing anything with art history.
So now you're working together and expanding what this program is. You're moving from fine arts, and I think you were mentioning earlier going into agriculture. Can you go into that a little bit?
I can. So the Monuments program, my position in the Army is Heritage and Preservation Officer. And this is only a snippet of what the larger program is. So the larger program is 38 Golf, or 38G, and it's functional specialty. It's military specialist, and it's military specialist in many different fields. So, I'm an art historian doing heritage and preservation, but even with my position, there are archaeologists, there's also an archivist that have their own, but there's also 6 uniforms, so that's agriculture, business, and food. You get the next slide. There's commerce and trade. Next slide. And these are them signing memorandums of understanding with different universities, like the U.S. military. There's energy. So the heritage is only a snippet of this larger program, but I think and I think it's, it's evident that cultural heritage kind of goes into all of these different things, right? Food, is a tangible but also intangible heritage that's important to people. So, commerce and trade, what are they doing? A lot of times if they're making objects for the tourist market, right? Like that, usually it's some kind of cultural heritage with it. So, it's just a larger program that is really focusing on governance rather than focusing on establishing government into different parts of the world that we may be needed there.
Can you expand upon that, governance versus government?
Yeah, so governance are the systems that are in place that not necessarily ran by the government, right? So there are, we think about, like I said, heritage, you think about the food, you think about religion. So what are those different entities of a community that needs to be stabilized in order for them to do well? And once again, it's a lessons learned. We learned we have to make sure that there's many different things that stabilize, right? So it's not just about kicking down doors. It's talking to the people, understanding what they have done and what works for them, rather than us saying, hey, we are the U.S. military and this is what we're gonna do for you. So the idea of giving agency to the host nation is part of that larger program. It's not just heritage and preservation that is going to do that work.
And do you see the relationships improving over time?
I think it will. I think it will. And I think because, to me, having the cultural heritage like as a jumpstart for the larger programs, right? So we were the first to have the memorandum of understanding signed. I think it's kind of like this goodwill, right? So this is a photo of from our monuments training, and you can see, hopefully, maybe or not, you can see possibly different uniforms. You can look at the boot colors; it's a little different. So we had the Carabinieri from Italy, and there was someone from Netherlands, Austria, the UK, Lebanon, France. So it's
wow, it's really global.
Oh yes, very global, right? So and that's how it was in with the World War II group, but emphasizing cultural heritage in an international perspective, I think, kind of shows that we're doing more, if we're trying to go beyond what we've done in the past. I think a lot of it is just lessons learned. We can't do it ourselves, and learning from them, right? So we had a soldier from France who worked in Timbuktu. There was someone from Lebanon who they established the cultural property protection group after the Beirut blast, right? So talking to different people, different parts of the world, understanding what they do, sharing what we know, and once again, that international partnership will, hopefully will transcend into all those different aspects as far as agriculture, commerce, and trade. That's
really interesting. And there's definitely an element of diplomacy, not just for the people living there, but also the military that's also stationed there at the same time. Do you see an evolution from, whereas in World War II, there was resistance to a program coming in to save art, and the military is there thinking, no, we have to think about the combat. Now, cut to, decades later, where it's not just art anymore, it's agriculture, and going to a military and saying we have to focus on the agriculture there. Are they less resistant now than they were in 1944? Do you see an improvement?
I will say, so with our military education, so, when you're in the military, you have to, the training doesn't stop. When you hit different ranks, you go to different types of schools. And I think this kind of perspective is being taught, right? So it goes back to, what the mission is, right? It's not just about, coming in and, setting up camp and saying, this is what we're going to do. It's establishing, what have we learned about what you need, the basics to have a stable community. Yeah.
Do you see this filtering into civilian life?
I say, why not? And I will say there's so many organizations now that does this job, and I think that's the great part with this position is we're signing. There's the memorandums that are happening with civilian institutions. We have our university partnerships. So there are people that's doing the civilian side, and having that relationship I think will only enhance what we do and just what happens in the world. Right? It's a very romantic, very romantic perspective, but I think it's true, right? It's a larger group. So, the military has their job, civilians have their job, and, we can both tackle things, but because of just what our organization is, we're able to have different, ranges where we can do things. The military, could only go so far. Same thing with civilians. They can only go so far. And I think having those two aspects really would help us.
I wonder if there's a template that you're developing that we can actually apply to our own society. Right now you're dealing with a military aspect, but what about here in, for example, in Los Angeles, where we're dealing with police force, and how do police force work with civilians? Are the same, tried and true ways of conducting law and order, do they work today? And so it's having that feedback from what you're doing with globally, are there any lessons there that and we don't have to answer this question, but speaking rhetorically, are there any lessons there that we could eventually apply to what's happening in our own home?
I'm an art historian. I think you can always learn things from history.
Well, thank you very much. This was a great talk. We look forward to having you back again. We'd love to expand upon this further. In the meantime, we'll take questions, and for everyone at home, thank you very much. We're glad you enjoyed this program, and we hope to see you here on a given Thursday.